Hello everyone, I'm Pratna Menghani,
And I'm Manas Kothar.
and we're going to be teaching you the flora of rhomboid fossa as well as their respective cranial nerve nuclei. I'd say this is a very important question because it helps you really understand and summarize all you've learned, like throughout for the nervous system in a short diagram. And if you understand this diagram, I think it's going to be very helpful. We'll begin right away. This is basically the brainstem showing us all different nuclei, and for our simplicity, we categorize them into afferent, efferent, visceral, somatic, and you'll see that later. This will give you a clear division and make it easier for you to understand which nuclei fall into which category and for what reasons. So let's get started.
Okay, so we'll start off with the topography and any topographical areas that we mentioned in our question. We have to start off with the borders. So anteriorly, we have the pons and the medulla oblongata. Posteriorly, we have the cerebellum and the choroid membrane, and these two form the roof. Superiorly, we have the third ventricle via the aqueduct of the midbrain. Inferiorly, we have the central canal of spinal cord, and finally, laterally on both sides, we have the recess from rhomboid fossa and the cerebellar peduncles. Um, so again, it's a very tricky area to actually localize. So you might see different um, structures for different borders in like, different sources. But I believe that you mentioned these in this video, then you should be fine. Okay. So together with the borders, we can mention some of the parts of which are associated with the flora of fossa. So if you see this middle line, uh, it's called the median sulcus, and median sulcus, the medial eminence, sulcus limitans, and these things you can easily figure out using the diagram here. Some things that you should know importantly are the facial folliculus, and these are fibers from the facial nucleus that curve around the abducent nucleus, so the abducent nerve, which is the sixth cranial nerve. Another important area is hypoglossal trigone, which accommodates the hypoglossal nerve nucleus. Vagal trigone we have for the vagus nerve nucleus. And yeah, those three things are the most important ones. So we'll start off with the efferent nuclei, and we just quickly mentioned the efferent nuclei in our presentation, but we'll discuss them in a greater detail. So firstly, we have the general somatic efferent nuclei, and these basically innervate like the skeletal muscles which are involved, which these nerves innervate. So we have out of these 12, we have four general somatic efferent nuclei, and these are for the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the abducens nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. Oculomotor nerve, as you may know, innervates the extraocular muscle, except the superior oblique and the lateral rectus. The trochlear nerve innervates the superior oblique muscle. The abducens nerve innervates the lateral rectus muscle, and hypoglossal nerve, as the name suggests, innervates the muscles of the tongue. Now, so you can use the abbreviation SO4 and LR6. SO4 means superior oblique, which is innervated by cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear, and LR6 is lateral rectus muscle innervated by adjacent nerve, which is cranial nerve 6.
Now I'll be talking about the other set of efferent nuclei. This is the general visceral efferent, and this is precisely the parasympathetic nuclei. Examiners like talking about this because many students don't focus on the parasympathetic innervation, but it's quite important. The first one being the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. It's basically the parasympathetic nuclei of cranial nerve 3. And then we have the superior salivatory and the inferior salivatory nucleus. The superior salivatory is by the cranial nerve 7, which is facial, and inferior by the glossopharyngeal cranial nerve 9. Many students get confused between these both, but just try to remember superior being with cranial nerve 7, facial, inferior being with glossopharyngeal. The last one, which is the most important set of parasympathetic nuclei, is the vagus nerve. They innervate practically a very big chunk of the body, focusing mainly on the abdominal viscera. And yes, this is important to know. Speaking specifically about each of the nuclei, the Edinger-Westphal nuclei of the oculomotor nerve innervates the sphincter pupillae and the ciliary muscles, and that's something you need to mention. Otherwise, everything's fine. For the superior salivatory, you can mention it's the greater petrosal nerve supplying the pterygopalatine ganglia and as well as the chorda tympani. For the inferior salivatory, it supplies the otic ganglion going to the parotid and the buccal glands. It's important to know which glands they innervate. So I think this is available on all websites, but like specifically with this diagram, you can know that which nuclei innervate which ganglions. So yes.
So now we'll move on to the specific visceral efferent nuclei. These nuclei give off fibers which actually innervate the muscles of the pharyngeal arches. So the first one, we have cranial nerve 5 trigeminal motor nucleus, which innervate the muscles of the first pharyngeal arch, and these include the masticatory muscles. These are the medial and the lateral pterygoid, the temporalis, and the masseter muscles. The second one, we have cranial nerve 7 nuclei, which is facial. These innervate the muscles of the second pharyngeal arch, and these are basically the facial expression muscles. Then we have the nucleus ambiguus, which give off fibers that contribute to 3 cranial nerves. These are the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and the accessory nerves. The glossopharyngeal nerve innervates the pharyngeal muscles. The vagus nerve innervates the laryngeal muscles, and the accessory nerve, as we know, innervates the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. Now, please do remember that the accessory nerve has 2 nuclei. It has a spinal nucleus, which gives the spinal component of the accessory nerve, whereas the nucleus ambiguus provides the cranial component of the accessory nerve.
Now we have the general or special visceral afferent nuclei. This doesn't have a specific group because it supplies the tongue, and that could be special or general. We have the solitary nucleus comprising of the cranial nerve 7, 9, and 10. It supplies the taste innervation to our tongue. The seventh one through the facial nerve through the chorda tympani, as well as the cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, as well as vagus. And they also have chemoreceptors from the carotid body and the aortic body, giving special innervation.
So now we'll move on to the general somatic afferent nuclei. These mainly consist of the 3 nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, the 3 sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. These are the mesencephalic nucleus, the principal pontine nucleus, and the spinal nucleus. The mesencephalic nucleus is mainly responsible for the proprioception of the masticatory muscles. The principal pontine nucleus is responsible for the touch sensation from the face, and the spinal nucleus is responsible for detecting temperature, pressure, crude touch, and pain from the facial region.
So Manas covered 1, 2, 4 of these afferent nuclei, and I covered previously the solitary nucleus supplying the tongue. The last one left is the vestibular nuclei. It's divided into cochlear and the vestibular part, basically the cranial nerve 8. The cochlear part receives auditory information from the cochlear nerve from the cochlea in the inner ear, and the vestibular is basically from there as well, but it's mainly for balance. And they have superior, inferior, medial, and lateral parts to it. And that's the end of the special somatic afferent nuclei.